Hey everyone, how's it going? So today I'm going to be presenting on the famous court case, which I'm sure you've all heard of, Whistler versus Longhorn. Who's heard of this court case? Right? Yeah, Joe, Matt. Anyone else? You guys don't know this?
I know.
You know it?
Yeah.
No? No one else? Oh,
Means I'm sure glad to be here today.
oh, that's good. Okay. So is this actually a court case, right? Am I actually, Russ, the Windows guy, coming up here and talking about policy? The answer is no, I'm actually not. I'm actually talking about Windows stuff again, but we'll get to that. So quick questionnaire. Who here thinks that Vista was awful, like Windows Vista, right? They hated it. It was an awful operating system. They hated using it. Yeah. For sure. If you've never used it, you just want to jump on the bandwagon, get your hand up.
Who has ever heard possibly?
That's a better question.
Complain
Yeah.
about Vista?
Yeah. Who's here heard how bad Vista is? How much it was, awful operating system? How Windows really messed that up, right? And who here has heard all the nostalgia? How great XP was? How like, oh man, I love XP. Those were the glory days of Windows, right? Yeah. Awesome, right? Yeah. So that's wrong. I'm going to prove to you why XP was an awful operating system. Not really awful, but it wasn't great from a security perspective. And why Vista was actually a really good operating system for Windows. And Microsoft actually, while like how they made Vista, right, how it was a resource hog wasn't great, and some of the things they did wasn't like the best. But overall, the improvements they made to Vista and moving from XP to Vista were actually really beneficial, especially in the security community. So let us start with a timeline. So in around 2001, I think it was like September, October-ish, XP was released. So 64-bit and 32-bit. It's just base XP. It was released. And then in 2004, we had Service Pack 1. So like Windows XP had all these service packs released for it because of the multiple like security issues and a lot of different problems that they had. But yeah, so Service Pack 1 was released in 2004. Service Pack 2 was then released, I think around 2005, maybe like early 2006. And then in 2006, Vista was released. So I remember that. I remember in 2007, my dad brought home a new laptop and it had Vista on it. And that was like the laptop that I grew up with. And so I grew up with Vista a lot and I ended up really not liking it. But we'll get into why I was wrong. And in 2008, XP Service Pack 3 was actually released. But fun fact, Service Pack 3 was not actually able to be installed on 64-bit due to the way that the Windows XP 64-bit kernel was made. So that was only for really 32-bit, and that just applied some different security patches to XP. But so that's a timeline, the general vicinity of time we're talking about. So just like XP was. So XP is like right now like 17 years old, and Vista is like 12. I think that's right. So just like a time frame for you guys. And so let's talk about XP first and kind of get this out of the way. So overall, right, XP was we have all that nostalgia for XP. We look back and we think about the classic background with the green hills and the blue sky. And we're like, oh man, and the nice sounds when we logged in as a kid, right? It brought back all those nice memories. At least for me it did. But it really sucked at security. And I'm sure we know this by now, right? We think of like all the famous exploits, right? Like MS-08, MS-03, was it MS-06? I can't remember exactly the name of that one. But MS-10, the famous Aurora exploit that was dropped on Google as a 0-day from somewhere like Chinese government or something. Was it MS-11? I believe it was Internet Explorer vulnerability. But anyways, you get the point, right? All these vulnerabilities, all these awful remote code execution vulnerabilities in XP. Like XP security-wise was not great, and we know that today, right? We think about that, and we don't associate like good security with XP, but we don't really associate that with Vista either, and we kind of like really take a shit on Vista quite a bit, right? We're like, oh, this is a crappy operating system. But Vista, a lot of things that it introduced into the Windows world are actually still continued on in Windows 10 today. So we're going to talk about some of those. And we're kind of going to compare it with XP and kind of the changes that they made from going from XP to Vista and what their like thought process was. So let's start with process integrity. So XP had really no concept of this. There was nothing really to do with process integrity. If you were an administrator or user, all your stuff was running at, I guess we'll say, a high integrity. This was a problem because if all your stuff is running at high integrity, there was no UAC, right? So with no process integrity, there's no way for basically no protection from lower integrity processes or like lower privileged users to talk to your like higher privileged processes or higher integrity processes. So this led to a lot of problems with like privilege escalation, where a lower integrity process or just a process run by a lower user could send a message to or any process running by like a higher privileged user. And so the famous attack was actually a shatter attack. This is a paper released in like 2001 or 2002 that described different methods to send like messages or like signals to higher privileged processes. And you could basically escalate your privileges using this vulnerability. And so this is a big problem and really opened the floodgates in terms of exploiting higher privileged processes. And so this is why in Vista, they implemented the mandatory integrity control. And so if you guys are familiar with UAC, so like when you, in like current day Windows, right, in Windows 10, you go and to open a command prompt, you're probably going to right click it and run as an administrator. That is UAC. So what you're doing is you're essentially elevating yourself from like a medium integrity process to a high integrity process. And that protection is built within the mandatory integrity control, or MIC. And MIC also states that lower integrity processes cannot talk to higher integrity processes. And this prevents a lot of those privileged escalation techniques that abuse the fact that you could talk as a lower integrity process to those higher integrity processes. So it completely defeat like shatter attack and stuff like that. That also like current day Windows, if you try to like remotely connect, right, like through PSExec as just like an administrator user, like that's in the administrator group, but it's not actually the administrator user, you're going to have problems doing different tasks because of UAC. And so there's like remote UAC protections as well. So all those protections in place really kind of prevented all those different privilege escalation attacks, and was a really good feature that was implemented in Vista. And again, this is in Windows 10 nowadays, right? It's still in Windows 10, still used, and Microsoft has kind of built upon the foundation that was put in Vista. So moving on, driver signing. No, it just wasn't really a thing in Windows XP. So rootkits were all around. You could just sign, you could just load any driver you wanted. So you could develop your own rootkit, right? Write your own rootkit and just load it all willy-nilly into XP. So this is like a big problem because say you went to the wrong website in like Internet Explorer back in the day on XP and you got popped, right? Someone just loaded a rootkit, high-level processes, and you were screwed. There's nothing you could do. And you didn't know what's happening because again, they're hiding all their stuff using rootkits. This was a big problem, and that's why like in sysinternals tools, if you check, they have like the rootkit checker. Obviously nowadays you never need that, but back in the day that was a pretty important tool. What's up?
Does that mean that you couldn't like run XP right now with like a secure boot enabled for UEFI?
That's a good question. What's up? Sorry. So the question was, does that not mean you could run what was it, secure boot with UEFI with XP?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Driver signing.
I don't think it had any. I don't believe so. I don't think honestly, I'm not sure the exact answer, but I don't think driver signing was like an all concept in Windows XP. So like even if you had secure boot enabled, I don't think that would prevent you from loading your own drivers.
You could brick the operating system.
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I never thought about that, but I'm gonna have to think about that. But good question. But thank God, Microsoft in Vista implemented what I think at the time was called like driver signature enforcement, but now they changed the name to driver signing enforcement. So this is implemented in Vista, and basically it forced you to have a valid certificate and sign your driver with that valid certificate, and then you could actually load the driver into your operating system and interact with the kernel and different drivers also loaded. So it's like the status quo nowadays. Or I guess the status quo nowadays, instead of just having requiring a valid cert, you actually have to submit your driver to Microsoft for approval. So you can't just like write a rootkit and be like, hey Microsoft, here's my rootkit, can you sign it? They're just gonna tell you no, go away. And they'll also, if you hijack someone else's cert, they're pretty proactive about revoking certs. There's been a ton of cases where people have like hijacked certs from like really shady companies, but they were like proper certs to sign drivers, and people would hijack them, Microsoft has been pretty good about revoking those and staying on top of that. So Microsoft has been very adamant about protecting the kernel and preventing people from using kernel land against the users. So that was very interesting. But continuing on, so does anyone here remember like the classic phrase, oh, delete system32, right? That was like the classic back in the day. Yeah, yeah. In XP, that was, you could just right-click delete on system32. I don't know if it would yell at you. It probably would, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty easy to do it. And you could just go through and delete it all willy-nilly. And you could also like rename binaries and everything and backdoor and create your own fake CMD, right? And just slap it in there in the place of the regular CMD. Go ahead, have fun, have a great time. But in Windows Vista and onwards, they implemented an account called Trust Installer, which basically took ownership of all the critical system resources. And this account, like no other account, has privileges besides this account to actually edit these files or make changes. This is part of the Windows Resource Protection thing they had in place. And so essentially, the only way to actually, in Windows 10, or Windows Vista and onwards, and now Windows 10, the only way to actually like edit these files or delete these files, you have to actually take ownership of all of them, which you can still do, right? If you're an administrator or user, you can still take ownership of all the files, delete them all, do whatever you want, and break your system, right? But it's still a very tedious and difficult task, and it's not, there is protections in place rather than just having everything owned by, administrator or system or whatever they had before. So, what's up? Really? What did it say?
It says, let me try it again.
Are you an administrator?
It just says it's required for Windows to run properly and deleted.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm wrong. So apparently XP is very secure. So sorry, guys. Okay.
1 point for Windows XP security right there.
Yeah, it's slowly but surely. And here's another one. You got me again. So PatchGuard was actually implemented in XP, and that's a current feature that's in Windows 10 that basically prevents you from hooking system calls and like performing basic rootkit actions. So like performing like direct edits of like kernel objects, or like again hooking important system call tables or just important tables in the kernel. So essentially, all like basic rootkit functionality, right, is basically prevented by PatchGuard. And this was actually implemented in XP. So score up another point for XP in terms of security. Actually, just go home and reinstall it on my daily driver. It's that good. But
Presented on a Mac.
true. So anyways, moving on. So service accounts were also kind of not great in XP. So service accounts, I've kind of went over this before, but basically are used to run services. There's three main kinds of service accounts. There's local system, which is equivalent to your root account on Windows. You have your network service, which has like next to no privileges, and also your local service, which has next to no privileges. But again, used to run services, and for the most part, people would kind of default to the local system account when they're developing services because it has all the privileges. So you don't need to do any like, oh, I wonder if this is going to break if it's running as local service, or will it be able to perform this action if it's running as network service. There's none of that, right, if you're just running as local system. And this is a problem in XP because if you need like a certain privilege that local service or network service didn't have, you're pretty much screwed and you had to use local system, which is not safe and not great. But in Vista, they actually allowed you to create your own custom service accounts. So you could just load any services with any account. So you could customly define privileges or permissions with that account, and that way it was safer, and you weren't always having to default to local system. And so this prevented, basically just promoted more fine-grained control over what permissions a service could have, which is great. Because once you get the local system, right, you pretty much own the entire box. You can do whatever you want. So firewall, it was kind of a joke in XP. So like XP, Service Pack 0 and 1 didn't really have a firewall. It was like the network internet connection sharing center, security center, something like that. It was really bad. You just basically could like click different things that you wanted to allow out, and there was no like actual allowing ports or like inbound, outbound traffic. There's no concept of that, right? It was like really shitty. You couldn't really use it. If you have been in CCDC, you've probably seen it. It's really bad. But SP2 kind of had, Service Pack 2 kind of had one, but it was just like really basic, and you could actually allow inbound and outbound traffic and specify which direction it was going and specify certain ports. But again, still wasn't that great. But then, in Vista, they implemented the Advanced Firewall, which this was basically a whole new interface that was built on top of a subsystem called the Windows Filtering Platform, the WFP. And this essentially had actual APIs that you could use and all these different features that essentially you could go through and specify, like, hey, I want this program allowed out, going outbound, but don't allow it back in. And you had a lot more fine-grained control over what you could do. And like I said, you have actual APIs now, so any third-party products that want to utilize the WFP could actually utilize it properly instead of doing some like janky, using undocumented functions, right? So Microsoft really made an effort to formalize this and make this a more like standard thing within Windows. And I say it's more comparable now to like IP tables, right? You have that more fine-grained control. There's logging. I'd say IP table is probably a little bit stronger, but still a great step in the right direction. And the Advanced Firewall is still used in Windows 10 and is now part of like the Windows Defender Security Center, or whatever it's called nowadays. So I think this is the last thing, but sandboxes. So in XP, I didn't make an XP slide for this, but XP didn't have any concepts of sandboxes, right? There was a ton of Internet Explorer vulnerabilities like IE6, IE5, and there was no sandbox. So once they exploited it and you were administrator, they pretty much got those privileges as soon as they exploited it. So yeah, you pretty much owned from the get-go if you ever went to the wrong site on XP. But with Vista, it used sandboxes, which essentially use like the whole point of sandbox, right, is to use a broker process. And that broker process has either like basically medium or lower privileges. And so if they actually exploit Internet Explorer, find some vulnerability, they're still within that sandbox. So they are still like, they're at like a medium or like low integrity. I think in like Edge now, it's like untrusted integrity. So you can basically do nothing. Like you can't access any files, you can't write to anywhere, except for where Internet Explorer can write to. So this edition was very nice. It was kind of continually built upon until now we have Edge and the whole protected mode within Edge, which is very powerful and actually pretty safe. So just to wrap everything up, let's talk about what was carried on to 10. So pretty much everything I talked about. Driver signing enforcement is now on 10. Like I said, you need to actually submit your driver to Microsoft and have them sign it and approve it and go through all that process. So it's a lot more involved and a lot more safer. So you can't just load a driver all willy-nilly anymore. Service hardening, you can create custom service accounts within Windows 10 and have them run your own custom services or third-party applications. Windows resource protection, still in Windows 10, you still just can't, you can still take ownership of the files, but again, it's kind of the raising the bar in terms of difficulty of going through and being able to just delete system critical files. And like Brad said, I guess you can technically not just delete system 32 like that, but protections are still the bar has still been raised with that program. And then the mandatory integrity control, MIC, was also carried on through Windows 10, and it's been kind of expanded on. And sandboxes, especially in like Edge and IE, heavily use the integrity control to protect the users from like exploits and basically people trying to exploit the system through the browser. And yes, it's sandboxing in Edge, kind of talked about that. And then the Advanced Firewall, still in Windows 10. So again, the whole point of this presentation was kind of show you guys that Vista wasn't really as bad of an operating system as everyone made it out to be. These are all features, right, that were implemented in Vista and that were then carried on to 10. So I think, it's easy to hop on the bandwagon and say, wow, like Vista sucked. It's such a resource hog. It blue screen my box all the time. Whatever your complaint was about Vista. But I think we need to take a step back and kind of look at the facts and kind of look and see and appreciate the features and the different security features, especially that Vista implemented and has been carried onwards through subsequent releases of Windows. So, yeah, any questions, any comments, any rebuttals? What's up?
Of the Windows security features, which one do you think is the most impactful for the overall platform security?
That's a great question. I would say, oh, sorry, I have to read the question. So the question was, out of all those security features, which was the most impactful to modern day Windows? I would honestly say probably the integrity control, mandatory integrity control. That just really made Windows a lot harder to exploit. Even with a remote UAC, I still struggle like having like, if I'm PS execing into a box, I'm like having to fight with remote UAC all the time. And even if you're on a box, right, going from, trying to escalate from like a really low user, like a low integrity user, can be really difficult. And so that has really put a lot of different security protections in place. And like I know Microsoft has built a lot of sandbox features off of that integrity model. So it's really powerful. And then like second, I would say like driver signing has been huge, but that's more for like you don't see that come into play a lot. Like with the integrity model, I feel like it really plays into like everyday usage of Windows. So yeah, good question. I appreciate it. What's up? Yeah. So you're So you're submitting. So the question was, in terms of driver signing, are you submitting your source code or what are you submitting? You're actually submitting your source code, like your whole like Visual Studio project, right? Your source code, everything, and they're looking through all of that. So like I said, you can't just submit like, oh, here's my totally legit driver that's definitely not a rootkit. You can't just do that. They'll catch it, right? They have actual people reviewing it. And I think even for different, if you want to do different things within the kernel, you have to have certain, like if you want to have a protected process, for example, right? Like with antivirus nowadays, they're like protected processes. You have to have a special cert. You have to have like an ELAM cert, it's called. And to get an ELAM cert, you actually have to be like an AV vendor, a trusted AV vendor. So you can't just like make your own fake company and be like, hey, like I'm totally an AV vendor, right? They're just gonna be like, get out of here. So yeah, they do a pretty stringent and secure process for that, as far as I'm aware. So good question, I appreciate it. What's up?
What are some resources we can use to learn more about this?
In regards to like what specifically, just, oh, sorry, I have to repeat the question, I'm really bad. What are some more resources that you guys could use to learn more about this? So, I mean, do you have any like specific like things or?
Like what resources you would use to learn about this?
For sure.
Like get more in-depth technical understanding without actually reading kernel code.
Yeah. I would say honestly just like TechNet, like Microsoft's TechNet is a great resource for kind of researching Windows and kind of learning more about the Windows internals. That's what I use personally. There's like, if you're more interested in like undocumented stuff like I am, there's a lot of like websites based around like undocumented APIs or like undocumented things within Windows. There's one guy, he's a software developer. His name is Geoff Chappell. He has like a whole web page basically developed like documenting everything in Windows. It's like pretty crazy. The guy's like crazy smart. Definitely look that up. Even if you're not interested in that kind of stuff, it's pretty cool to read some of his work. So yeah, great question though. Appreciate it. Anyone else have anything else? Cool. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.